So interesting to watch a ghoul like Anne Applebaum become literally hysterical, like shaking with rage in the way that people with no self-control do, when Viktor Orban says stuff like, well, I just don't want to admit like 1 million non-Hungarians into my country.
Yeah.
And they go crazy.
Yeah. I mean, you look at how they respond to somebody like Orban, and like they would color revolution that dude in a second if they thought they could get away with it. If they didn't think it was,
I know Orban well. He's hardly like a right-wing crazy.
Yeah.
He's like very moderate and kind of like liberal in an 80s way.
I think that's probably the only reason they don't try it, is they know that like his chief opposition is far to the right of him. So that's probably why they don't do it. But
he's like the least extreme world leader I've ever met.
Yeah. It's funny. It's like, I get a similar sense from Mr. Putin in Russia where, he's a hard man. You don't drag Russia out of its state in the 1990s without being a hard man. But it's probably hoping for a little too much that whoever follows him up, if we were to do something that would end his rule, that whatever would come next would be beneficial to us.
Okay, so Trump, Orban, and Putin, I can say, this is my perception of all three of them, is that none of them is particularly ideological. All three are pretty sincere nationalists, not like crazed ideological nationalists, but just sort of want to do the best for their country. None of them is like a religious nut, and none of them is like especially right wing. They're all in the 1984, 5, 6 context. They would be sort of moderate, maybe conservative Democrats, liberal Republicans. Like they're not at all what people claim they are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the post-World War II order is really defined by the fact that, after Nuremberg, it really became effectively illegal in the West to be like genuinely right-wing. Like the things we call right-wing, I mean, it's all flavors of liberalism, basically, right? And like if you go back and read pre-war conservatives, pre-war right-wing writers, in Europe, like literally in a lot of places, it became illegal to be that way, right? And here again, it's not quite illegal, but we have control mechanisms that are almost as effective.
U.S. government sent a lot of people to prison over the years for their political use, a lot.
That's true. And that's like a defining aspect of the post-war European order, right? And as long as that order remains in place and remains a dominant factor, it's going to be very hard for them to escape this cycle. And I want to be clear too, when I say like that it's the worst thing that can happen, I don't mean that, well, now you have to live next to these people who don't look like you or who, speak differently. It has something to do with that.
I get it.
You're talking about a people, and again, this is why I spent so much time on why it's harder for Americans to kind of really understand this. It's because of our historical experience with just demographic turnover.
Right.
We kind of have this idea, even though we're being pushed to our limits right now, and you're really starting to see that because of the ideological forces and the cultural forces that are making it much, much harder to swallow and digest the current crop of new immigrants since 1965, much harder to assimilate for various reasons. So we're approaching our limit here, but we still have this kind of idea in America that, these things are going to happen and then we'll figure it out and renegotiate, and kind of America will be different. But, in another generation or two, more change will be happening. And that's just, the dynamic of the United States. And so we always have this sort of feeling that in terms of our collective identity, like we'll figure it out. You go to a place like, any European nation where this is a people's ancient homeland. And there's actually such thing as, an Englishman. There's such thing as that. Like an American is something that, again, the definition of it changes with every generation. And it's always been that way. The definition of an Englishman has never changed, and it never will change. And those people, the English people.
Not for over 1,000 years. Not since 1066.
Right. And so in those people they're in the process right now of forever losing the only spot of land that they have on this earth that is dedicated to the flowering and the preservation of the English people. Like and it's a tiny little spot.
It's true for the Dutch. It's true for the Spanish. It's true for the Germans. It's true for the Belgians. It's true for every Western European nation. So why not have a Nuremberg trial for the people who did that? I don't understand. I mean, that's such a crime.
Well, we have to win first.
Yeah. Well, but I just think it's important to say out loud that that's a crime.
It's
an
inconceivable
hundreds of millions of people.
If you go back to bring up like Louis XIV or any powerful monarch, they never would have dared imagine that they could do that to their people without getting their head cut off. They wouldn't have dared imagine that they could just replace their people with, people from a different continent, different religion, different language, just to overwhelm them, to make their own people a minority in that country for whatever reason, ideological, economic, whatever it was. They wouldn't imagine that they had the right, the power, the ability to do that, And I said something to you yesterday when we were having dinner that I would probably feel somewhat differently about this if it was a situation where, over the last 8 generations of English people, of British people, that they had just sort of like gradually brought people in from around the world. And over the course of 200 years or 300 years, they had just transformed the demography of their island into something unrecognizable. Because you could look at that and say, well, I don't necessarily think that's the best idea for them, or, I don't like the changes that are being made. But hey, the English people, they made this decision over the course of 200 years.
Exactly. It's like their food. I won't eat their food. It's disgusting, but they like it, and that's okay.
But this one generation decided that they had no responsibility to any of the people who came before them, and they have no responsibility to any of the people who are coming after them. They are going to permanently, radically, irreparably transform their society in ways that they know hurt the majority of the population. They've immunized themselves from, at present, but that they know are not welcome and are harmful to the majority of the people that they rule over. And one generation of people decided that they had the right to do that. And
it's the post-war generation. It's the generation born in 1946, between 1946 and 1964. That's who did that.
Yep.
So it's hard to escape the obvious conclusion, and I suspect this is part of what's driving your current project, that war didn't just redraw borders, but it changed the world in ways that are still unfolding, and that whose like profound nature we're only now beginning to appreciate. Is that right?
Sure. I'm a big fan of the writer René Girard, right? He talks about, he's got this whole big theory about the origin of human religion and sacrificial ritual and stuff. But putting aside like his broader speculations about the origin of religion, one of the things he talks about is if you look through the myths of every society you can pretty much think of throughout history, if you look at like the national origin stories of any nation or people that you can think of, it is almost without exception, and it may be without exception, that there's blood at the beginning of that story. There's, and it's framed, because it's a sacred story, it's framed as sacrificial blood, right? And now sometimes, like, he'll give examples of...
That is true.
He'll give examples of sometimes, there's like his basic theory, right, is that when a society finds itself in a time of tremendous turmoil, and it may be just disunion, or like people can feel like we have right now, since like 2015 or however long it's been, there's just this tension where people kind of, in moderate people, regular people that aren't typically political, right and left for that matter, everybody kind of has this feeling that this can't just keep going the way it's going. Like, we're approaching some sort of a point where decisions are going to have to be made, confrontations are going to have to occur, and a decision is going to have to be made because there's just too much ambivalent energy pulling us in every direction. People feel it in their daily lives, and and so that starts to happen to a society. And he points to all these examples throughout history and ancient mythology, right, where he'll talk about how there's some problem that was, a plague is plaguing Thebes, and whatever example you want to give. And they find the scapegoat person for this, and Jonah being thrown overboard into the sea, to calm the storm. And what do you know? We found the culprit, we found the perpetrator, the one who had like brought this curse upon the city because of his own private sin or whatever it was, and we got rid of that person, and now everything is actually better. And now the plague went away and the storm stopped and something. And so what Girard says is this is a very interesting insight, I think, is he says what these all are, these are post hoc apologias for what these people did.
Exactly.
They're looking back and saying that, this person who we murdered, that we had to do that, but then there's another little weird dynamic where that person sort of becomes deified, because at the end of the day, they did have the power to restore order and peace to the society, to make the plague go away. And there's also a sort of ambivalent feeling, because somewhere in there, they do know that they murdered this person as a scapegoat.